Hello hockey fans and welcome back to another video. At the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month, the world holds a minute of silence in honour of military personnel who have fallen in the line of duty. Since the tradition was formed after the First World War, and since Remembrance Day continues to be honoured over a century later, millions of people have been affected by numerous conflicts since the memorial's inception, including several members of the National Hockey League. Given that Remembrance Day is right around the corner now, I felt that we should highlight the NHL players that served in the military during a time of conflict, and take a moment to honour those who gave their lives in service of their country. So in today's video, join me as we explore when NHL players went to war. Now before we get into it, there are thousands of hockey players across the world that have served their countries during wartime, and while I would love to give each and every one of them the time and attention that they truly deserve, it would be impossible for me to do so in a single video. Because of this, I have decided to focus on the most notable players and the most tragic incidents from each major conflict, so we can appreciate the achievements of those who survived, while honouring those who made the ultimate sacrifice too. We'll start at the very beginning with the First World War of 1914 to 1918. Now while the NHL wasn't formed until 1917, there were several hockey players, both professional and amateur, who fought in the conflict, so it's only right that they are included in this video too. One of the game's greatest players during the pre-NHL era, Frank McGee would lift the Stanley Cup on 4 separate occasions as a member of the Ottawa Silver Seven, and he would score 14 goals in a single game against the Dawson City Nuggets during his career. After retiring from the sport in 1906, McGee would join the 43rd Regiment of the Canadian Infantry once war broke out in August of 1914. And though he could only see out of one of his eyes, McGee was able to trick the doctor into clearing him for active duty. Unfortunately though, McGee would never return from the Western Front, as he was killed in action during the Battle of the Somme on September 16, 1916 at the age of 33. In honour of his sacrifice and his impressive career in the sport, McGee became one of the original inductees to the Hockey Hall of Fame when it was founded in 1945. One of the best wingers in the game during the sport's formative years, Scotty Davidson would spend a pair of seasons in the National Hockey Association, the precursor to the NHL, where he potted 42 goals and 55 points in just 40 regular season games during that span. Once war broke out in 1914, Davidson became the first professional hockey player to volunteer with the Canadian Expeditionary Force, as he joined the 14th Infantry Regiment in September of that year. Though he would earn the respect of his fellow soldiers due to his bravery on the battlefield, and though there are conflicting reports as to how he met his fate, Davidson would ultimately perish during the conflict, as he was killed on June 16, 1915, at the age of 24. The future owner of the Toronto Maple Leafs, Conn Smythe, was studying at the University of Toronto and captaining the men's varsity hockey team when war broke out in 1914, so he enlisted into the armed forces a week after winning the OHA championship in March of 1915. From there, Smythe would command an artillery battery near the Somme, he would earn a military cross for his heroic actions, and he would join the Royal Flying Corps as an airborne observer before his plane was shot down by the Germans on October 14, 1917. Having been captured by the enemy, Smythe would be imprisoned in southwest Poland, and though he would attempt to escape on 2 separate occasions, he would remain as a POW until the end of the war. The first hockey superstar to hail south of the border, Hobey Baker became one of the first Americans to join the war effort, as he enlisted into the United States Air Force in 1917. Though he wouldn't be sent to the front until January 1918, Baker would spend 11 months leading planes over the battlefield, and he earned the Croix de Guerre from the French government as a result of his efforts. Unfortunately though, Baker wouldn't make it back to North America, as he was killed on December 21, 1918, while testing a repaired plane just hours before he was set to return home. Baker was 26 years old at the time. In honour of his sacrifice, Baker was posthumously entered into the Hockey Hall of Fame as one of its original inductees in 1945, while the NCAA awards their top player with a trophy bearing his name every season, a tradition that continues to this very day, over a century after his death. Alongside Baker, both George Richardson and Edward Abbott also produced impressive careers in the sport, Richardson in the Ontario Senior League and Abbott in the Saskatchewan Senior League. They both perished during the war, and they both had awards named after them in honour of their sacrifice, so they also deserved a moment of recognition too. And last but by no means least, the Winnipeg Falcons, who won a gold medal at the 1920 Olympic Games, saw 7 of their 8 players serve in the Great War, but only 5 of them made it home, as Frank Thorsteinsson and George Cumbers were both killed in action. While there is no official count on the number of hockey players to have served in World War I, it is believed that more than 30 Canadians who perished had significant ties to the sport. Because of this, the Memorial Cup was created in 1919 to pay tribute to each and every Canadian who died at war, an award that is still given to the top team across the Canadian Hockey League over a century later. We now shift our attention to the Second World War of 1939 to 1945, where a sizable number of NHL players put their careers on hold in order to serve their country, including some of the best skaters across the entire league. Known as the Kraut Line due to their German heritage, Boston Bruins forwards Milt Schmidt, Woody Dumart and Bobby Bauer all enlisted into the Canadian Air Force on the exact same day in 1942. After 4 years of service for their country, the trio would all make it home, they would resume their NHL careers shortly after, and they would pick up right where they left off, as they continued to light the league on fire for several more seasons. After each member retired from the sport, all 3 were eventually inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, Schmidt in 1961, Dumart in 1992, and Bauer in 1996. The centerpiece of Detroit's production line, Sid Abel would put his career on hold in 1943, as he would enlist in the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War II. After 2 years of service, Abel would return to the NHL and pick up right where he left off, as he finished his career with 3 Stanley Cups and a Hart Trophy for his efforts. Abel was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1969, and he was named one of the NHL's greatest 100 players during its first century of existence. One of the most dynamic scorers of his era, Sil Apps would leave the NHL midway through his career, as he joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 1943. Following his 2 years in the military, Apps would rejoin the show and return to his old self almost immediately, as he finished his career with 5 All-Star nods and 3 Stanley Cups too. Apps was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1961, and he was named to the NHL 100 as one of the league's greatest players during its first century of existence. Before his long and successful NHL career began, Doug Harvey would serve his country during World War II, as he enlisted into the Canadian Navy in 1942. After 3 years of service, the Blue Liner would eventually make his way to the show in 1947, where he would go on to play over 1,100 NHL games during his career and earn 13 appearances at the All-Star Game, while also winning 6 Stanley Cups and 7 Norris Trophies while he was at it too. Harvey was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1973, and he was named one of the NHL's top 100 players during its first 100 years of existence. One of the premier netminders of his era, Tiny Thompson would play 12 seasons in the NHL and would earn a treasure trove of accolades during that span, as he won 4 Vezina trophies, earned 4 All-Star appearances, and lifted the 1929 Stanley Cup as a member of the Boston Bruins too. After retiring from the league in 1940, Thompson would enlist in the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1942 and serve his country until the end of the war. Thompson was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1959. Before his decorated NHL career began, Howie Meeker would serve in the Canadian Army during World War II, but he would be badly injured in the line of duty. After making a full recovery, Meeker would eventually join the NHL in 1947 and win his fair share of accolades, as he earned 4 Stanley Cups and 3 All-Star appearances during his 8-year career. Meeker would be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1998 thanks to his long and successful broadcasting career as a member of Hockey Night in Canada. Known as one of the most intimidating defensemen of his era, Ken Reardon enlisted in the Canadian Armed Forces in 1942, shortly after the 41-42 season concluded. After 3 years of service, and after being awarded a Certificate of Merit for acts of bravery during battle, Reardon would return to the show in 1945, where he would remain for the next half a decade. During his 7-year NHL career, Reardon would be named an All-Star on 5 different occasions, and he would be inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1966. One of the only Americans to be mentioned in this video, Frank Brimsek would step away from the NHL midway through his career, as he enlisted in the US Coast Guard in 1943. After 2 years of service, Brimsek would return to the show for half a decade and finish his career with 8 All-Star nods, 2 Vezinas, a Hall of Fame induction in 1966, one of the best skaters of his day, Max Bentley spent much of his prime serving in the Canadian military, as he joined the Infantry Corps in 1943. After 2 years in the army, Bentley would return to the NHL and finish his career with 2 scoring titles, 2 All-Star appearances, and an induction to the Hall of Fame in 1966. One of the premier goaltenders of his time, Turk Broder would take a 2-year hiatus from the NHL midway through his career, as he joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 1943. Once the war was over, Broder would return to the show and pick up right where he left off, as he finished his career as a 3-time All-Star with 2 Vezina trophies and 5 Stanley Cups to his name, 4 of which he won after the war. Broder was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1967, and he was named one of the NHL's greatest 100 players too. Veteran of 7 seasons in the NHL, Gord Drillon joined the Canadian military in 1943. From there, the 3-time All-Star and former Art Ross winner would serve 3 years in the Army before returning to North America. However, he would never rejoin the NHL after the war, as he would instead spend his time as a coach or a scout for various different organisations. Drillon was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1975. Having already served in a previous war, Leafs owner Conn Smythe would re-enlist into the Canadian Army in 1941 at the age of 45. From there, the World War I veteran would train soldiers in Toronto, form an anti-aircraft battery, was stationed in England for 2 years, and fought in France in 1944 before being badly wounded from a German bombing run. Though he would be shipped home and survive the war, Smythe would be forced to walk with a limp for the rest of his life due to his injuries. Smythe was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1958 as a builder of the sport, and he has an award named after him which is given to the league's most valuable player during the Stanley Cup playoffs. While most of the NHL's World War II veterans would survive the conflict and make it back home, not everyone was so fortunate, as several players would make the ultimate sacrifice in service of their country. Veteran of 23 NHL games during the 1942-43 season, Dudley Garrett would enlist in the Canadian Navy shortly after his debut in the show. However, Garrett would never return home from the war, as he was killed in action while serving on the HMCS Shawinigan during the Battle of St. Lawrence on November 24, 1944. Garrett was just 20 years old at the time. In honour of his sacrifice, the American Hockey League created the Dudley Red Garrett Memorial Award, which is given to the best rookie in the AHL every season and is still awarded to this very day. Owner of a single NHL game during his career, Joe Turner would serve in the United States Army during World War II, as he joined the 311th Infantry Unit as a second lieutenant. Unfortunately though, Turner wouldn't survive the conflict, as he was killed during the Battle of Hurtgen Forest on January 21, 1945. Turner was just 25 years old at the time. In honour of his ultimate sacrifice, the International Hockey League would name its championship trophy after him, and the Turner Cup would be awarded every season until the IHL ceased operations in 2001. According to the Society for International Hockey Research, 1,942 hockey players have served in the military over the last 100 years. Of those nearly 2,000 people, 276 of them made it to the NHL, while 376 of them ultimately perished in the line of duty. And of those 376, 3 of them had made it to the show, and 4 of them were posthumously inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. Now, while we've only discussed the 2 world wars here, and while plenty of hockey players have served in the military since then, the Russians who played for the Red Army team during the Cold War, for example, according to my research, there is no record of any NHL players that have actively fought on a battlefield since World War II. That said, there are plenty of soldiers who played hockey or were fans of the sport who lost their lives in the numerous conflicts since then, so it would be remiss of me to not mention them and give them their own moment of remembrance too. Whether they put their careers on hold during a time of conflict, or they gave their lives in service of their country, the NHL has as much reason to honour Remembrance Day as anyone else. Sure, some players were better than others, and some only spent brief stints in the show, but every single skater who paid the ultimate price deserves to be honoured for their sacrifice, whether they were a Hall of Famer or not. Say what you want about their scoring numbers or their impact on the sport, but some things in life are far more important than hockey. So thank you for your service, gentlemen. You will never be forgotten. And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. That was a look at when NHL players went to war. What do you think about the players we discussed and the stories we covered? Are you surprised that so many players were able to make it back home, or are you shocked at the number of casualties over the years? Also, if you want to share a story of your own time in the military, a family member's service, or a tale from someone you know, please do leave a comment down below. I would really love to hear what you guys have to say. But thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, or watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye. A big thank you to Bexy93, Burned Retinas, Clayton Hallam, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Raquel, and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.